Claire couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her heart pounded, and her hands shook as she stood frozen in the doorway. Daniel, the man she had loved and trusted for years, was sitting with Vanessa, laughing like she wasn't even there. Every look, every word, every laugh was meant to cut her down, and it worked. Claire felt small, humiliated, and betrayed, all at once. She wanted to turn around and leave, but something inside her wouldn't let her run. Instead, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked in. Every step felt heavy, but she forced herself to meet their eyes. Daniel didn't flinch, and Vanessa smirked, as if she had already won. Claire felt anger rising, but she knew she had to stay calm. This wasn't just about her pride, it was about what came next. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She replayed every insult, every mocking laugh, over and over in her head. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but it slowly turned into something else, determination. She realized Daniel had underestimated her, assumed she would crumble. He was wrong. She wasn't just a victim, she was someone who could plan, someone who could act. In the days that followed, Claire began observing, gathering pieces of the puzzle. Every lie Daniel had told, every excuse, every sneaky behavior suddenly made sense. She started connecting the dots quietly, without anyone noticing. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake, it was about reclaiming her dignity, her life, and her sense of power. Then, by a twist of fate, Claire met Michael, Vanessa's husband. At first, they were cautious, sharing stories carefully. But soon the truth became undeniable. Their spouses had been playing the same cruel game, mocking them, taking what they could while leaving pain behind. That shared understanding created a silent alliance. They didn't need to shout or confront immediately, patience was their weapon. Claire slowly regained her confidence, realizing she had more control than she thought. She could plan, prepare, and act without anyone suspecting. The humiliation she suffered wasn't the end, it was the beginning of her turning the tables. What Daniel and Vanessa thought was a victory became the start of their unraveling. Claire had learned that quiet strength and careful planning could be far more powerful than anger. By the time Daniel and Vanessa tried to celebrate their supposed success, Claire was already 2 steps ahead. She didn't need to yell or argue. The exposure of lies, the uncovering of secrets, and the consequences of their betrayal would speak louder than anything she could say. Claire had transformed her pain into power. She realized that betrayal didn't define her. It only revealed her strength. When the dust settled, she walked away not just unbroken, but stronger than ever, knowing she had reclaimed her life and her dignity. When Claire got home, the apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. The laughter of the evening, the cruel words, the way Daniel had looked at her, it all followed her like a shadow. She sank onto the couch and stared at the floor, trying to make sense of everything. For years, she had ignored small warning signs, the cold answers, the way he brushed off her feelings, the subtle insults she used to dismiss as jokes. Now, they all made sense. It hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate. Claire thought about the money that had gone missing, the sudden business trips, the nights he came home late with excuses she had always accepted. She realized now that he had been creating cracks in their life for a long time, preparing for this moment. It was like she had been living next to a stranger who had worn the mask of her husband so well that she hadn't seen the truth. Every late-night argument she thought was trivial, every harsh word she excused, was part of a larger plan she had never noticed. Anger mixed with sorrow in her chest. She remembered moments when she had tried to talk to him, asking for honesty, respect, or simply acknowledgement. He had ignored her, made her feel like she was overreacting, or turned the blame on her. Those moments had been gaslighting, making her doubt herself, making her feel like the problem was always hers. Now, she understood that it had been a strategy to keep her under control. Claire felt a shift inside her. She knew she could no longer beg for respect from someone who didn't care to give it. The thought of trying to fix something broken by someone who had already chosen betrayal made her stomach turn. She didn't want pity, and she didn't want excuses. She wanted control over her own life, her own emotions, and her own future. For the first time in years, she made a decision. She wouldn't plead for kindness or fairness anymore. She wouldn't wait for him to apologize or realize the damage he had done. She would take the power back quietly, carefully, and strategically. Her life wasn't over, and it wasn't defined by his betrayal. She would rebuild, piece by piece, stronger and wiser than before. Claire took a deep breath and looked around the apartment. The familiar walls no longer felt like a cage. They felt like a space where she could start again. She didn't know exactly how she would do it yet, but one thing was clear: she would not let Daniel's choices determine her worth or her happiness. She was done waiting. She was done being ignored. And most importantly, she was done letting anyone else control her life. From that moment on, Claire promised herself that she would live on her own terms, reclaiming every bit of dignity and respect that had been taken from her. Claire never expected to see Michael Cole, Vanessa's husband, in the first place. It was a quiet afternoon, and she had gone to the community center to sort out some paperwork for a charity board she and Daniel were both involved in. She noticed a man sitting at the table across from her, quietly reviewing a stack of documents. There was something familiar about him, a certain look of weariness in his eyes. Then it clicked: this was Michael, Vanessa's husband. At first, the encounter was awkward. They exchanged polite nods and went back to their paperwork. But as the documents got more complicated, they had to speak, clarify numbers, and compare details. Every time Michael spoke, Claire noticed a careful choice of words, as if he were holding back something he wanted to say. There was a tension, a quiet sadness, that mirrored her own. She realized he, too, was feeling confused and hurt, though he hadn't admitted it to anyone. It didn't take long for the conversation to turn personal. Claire, cautious but needing an ally, asked about his wife's involvement in recent events. Michael's face hardened, and he sighed. He admitted that he had long suspected something was wrong. Late nights, odd excuses, hidden expenses, they were all signs he couldn't ignore. But he had never been able to find proof. Claire nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. For the first time since discovering Daniel's betrayal, she wasn't alone. Here was someone else who had been hurt by the same pair, someone who understood the silent questions, the creeping doubts, and the frustration of not knowing the truth. Michael wasn't loud or aggressive, he was quiet, observant, and thoughtful. It was a sharp contrast to the arrogance and cruelty of their cheating spouses, and it gave Claire a sense of hope. Over the next hour, they shared small pieces of information, dates, excuses, odd behaviors. Each detail added another layer to the picture they were forming. The connection was fragile at first, built on mutual suspicion and careful observation, but it was real. They weren't friends yet, and they didn't need to be. They just needed to understand each other and confirm the reality that had been slowly revealing itself to both of them. By the time they left the community center, Claire felt a spark of determination she hadn't felt before. Having an ally, even a quiet, cautious one, changed the dynamic. It wasn't about revenge in that moment. It was about knowledge, clarity, and preparation. Together, they could see patterns, uncover truths, and plan the steps necessary to regain control of their lives. As she walked to her car, Claire realized that the bond she had formed with Michael, however tentative, was important. It gave her strength. It gave her direction. And most importantly, it reminded her that even in betrayal, unexpected alliances could emerge, helping her see the path forward clearly for the first time in months. Claire and Michael sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, stacks of papers and receipts spread between them. The silence was heavy at first, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They both knew why they were there. Claire handed Michael a folder filled with notes she had kept, dates, strange charges, unexplained trips, and odd behavior she had dismissed for years. Michael did the same, revealing details of his own experiences, things that didn't make sense at the time but now formed a pattern. As they went through each piece of evidence, comparing timelines and cross-checking stories, the picture became clearer and darker. Daniel and Vanessa weren't just cheating. Their affair was calculated. Every lie, every late night, Every excuse was part of a deliberate plan to hurt and control. They had mocked their spouses quietly, under the surface, as if knowing the full humiliation would only come later. The cruelty was precise, almost surgical, designed to make Claire and Michael doubt themselves while they stripped away trust, money, and security. Claire felt her chest tighten as she looked at a series of receipts for expensive dinners, gifts, and trips she had assumed were part of Daniel's business expenses. Michael pointed out similar patterns with Vanessa. It became impossible to deny. Their spouses had coordinated, even if not consciously together, to leave them exposed, defenseless, and humiliated. The betrayal was more than emotional, it was strategic. Every action they had taken, every story they had spun, had been calculated to maintain a sense of power while slowly dismantling Claire and Michael's lives. Anger bubbled inside Claire, but she pushed it down. She had learned that impulsive reactions wouldn't help. She needed clarity and strategy. Michael, though visibly shaken, shared the same thought. They had the truth now. They could see the full extent of the lies and the manipulation. Knowing this wasn't just relief, it was a weapon. As they continued comparing documents, something changed. The fear, confusion, and sorrow they had carried for weeks began to turn into something else, resolve. They had proof, and that proof meant control. They weren't at the mercy of Daniel and Vanessa anymore. The hidden plans, the private mockery, the manipulations, all of it was visible now. By the end of their session, Claire felt a strange calm. The betrayal had been cruel, but the exposure of the truth had shifted the balance. They had names, dates, evidence, they had power. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about knowing exactly what they were up against and being prepared to respond in a way that would reclaim their dignity. As they packed up the papers, Claire glanced at Michael. The bond between them had grown stronger, built not on friendship yet, but on shared clarity and understanding. Together, they were no longer victims. They were aware, alert, and ready. And for the first time since discovering Daniel's betrayal, Claire felt like she had a chance to take back control of her life. Claire and Michael sat together in a small, quiet room, going over everything they had discovered. The truth was heavy, and the anger was real, but neither of them wanted to react in the moment. They both understood that loud confrontations would only play into Daniel and Vanessa's hands. Explosive reactions might satisfy the immediate need for revenge, but they wouldn't protect their lives, their money, or their dignity. Instead, they decided on patience. They formed a silent agreement, a quiet pact, to be careful and deliberate. They wouldn't let anyone see how much they knew, and they wouldn't act until the timing was right. It wasn't about playing games, it was about survival and strategy. Every lie, every betrayal, and every manipulative move by Daniel and Vanessa had taught them that impulsive anger only benefited the cheaters. They agreed to document everything meticulously. Every bill, every unexplained expense, every suspicious behavior would be recorded. They would protect themselves legally and financially, making sure that if the situation escalated, they would have evidence that could not be ignored. Michael handled what he needed to secure quietly, and Claire did the same. They shared information but kept plans to themselves, understanding that trust was only partial in this fragile situation. Claire felt a sense of calm she hadn't had in weeks. This was different from the fear and sadness that had consumed her before. Now, she had control over her actions. She realized that by letting Daniel and Vanessa underestimate her, she gained a powerful advantage. The cheaters had grown arrogant, thinking they had already won. That arrogance would be their weakness. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Michael worked quietly, focusing on their own lives while observing the others. They didn't need to provoke or argue. They didn't need to beg for respect or make their pain public. Their pact was simple: stay calm, gather evidence, and wait. Every action would be deliberate, every word measured. This quiet approach gave Claire strength. She could breathe again without the constant weight of betrayal pressing on her chest. She knew the cheaters were unaware of how much they had underestimated her, and that thought alone fueled her determination. She wasn't plotting revenge out of hatred, she was preparing to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her future. By the end of the month, Claire realized something important. Patience wasn't weakness. It was power. By staying quiet, by protecting herself, and by letting the cheaters reveal their own arrogance, she had taken the first step in turning the tables. She no longer felt like a victim. She felt like someone in control, ready to act at the right moment, and determined to emerge from the betrayal stronger than ever. Claire felt a shift inside her. After weeks of careful observation, quiet planning, and sharing information with Michael, she started to feel the heavy weight of fear and sadness lift. The anger was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it became fuel to take back control of her life. She realized that reclaiming power didn't mean lashing out or causing chaos. It meant preparing herself, regaining confidence, and making choices that would secure her future. She began with her finances. Claire reviewed bank statements, credit accounts, and property documents. She noted what was hers, what Daniel had access to, and what needed protection. She met with a lawyer quietly, not for revenge, but to understand her rights and ensure she wouldn't be left vulnerable. Every document she examined, every plan she made her feel stronger. She no longer felt helpless or trapped. Michael did the same. He quietly checked his finances, separated his accounts, and reviewed any suspicious activity. Together, they shared notes when necessary, but mostly, they focused on themselves. There was no competition between them, only a shared goal: regain independence and control. Neither of them wanted to hurt their spouses in anger. Their goal wasn't revenge, it was dignity. Claire also focused on herself personally. She started exercising again, dressing in ways that made her feel confident, and spending time doing things she loved. Each small step reminded her that her life wasn't defined by Daniel's betrayal. She felt proud of herself for taking action instead of falling apart. Every decision, every move, was a way of reclaiming her identity. By carefully planning her next steps, Claire realized she could make choices freely without fear of manipulation. She didn't have to ask Daniel for permission or approval. She didn't have to feel ashamed or small anymore. The sense of independence, even in small ways, grew each day. She could breathe, think clearly, and see a future she could control. Both Claire and Michael recognized that their strength didn't come from punishing anyone. It came from taking responsibility for their own lives. They were regaining what had been taken from them, not through chaos or drama, but through preparation, awareness, and careful planning. They were no longer victims. They were people reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. By the time the days passed, Claire felt empowered. She could see clearly what needed to happen next, and she had the confidence to act when the time was right. The betrayal had hurt deeply, but it no longer defined her. Every choice she made now was about justice, dignity, and control over her life. She had taken the first real steps toward independence, and with that power, she was ready to face whatever came next. The evening was bright and formal, filled with laughter, sparkling glasses, and the polite chatter of family and friends. Daniel and Vanessa moved through the room with easy confidence, smiling and nodding as if nothing had ever happened. They had been planning this night for weeks, a celebration of their new beginnings, a way to show everyone how successful and untouchable they were. Claire arrived quietly, dressed simply but elegantly, her heart steady. She wasn't here to argue or cry. She was here to show the truth. Michael joined her, calm and composed. They didn't rush. They didn't whisper. They simply moved through the room, observing, waiting for the right moment. The confidence in their steps was subtle but powerful. They knew the impact of patience, and the time had finally come. When Daniel and Vanessa began their rehearsed announcements, Claire cleared her throat and stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She calmly presented the documents they had both collected over the past weeks: receipts, timelines, and records of lies. Michael followed, adding details that made the deception undeniable. Each piece of evidence was simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. The room went quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Faces that had smiled seconds ago now reflected shock and disbelief. Daniel's smug expression faltered. Vanessa's confident smile slipped. The control they had thought they held over everyone vanished in an instant. Claire and Michael didn't need to yell or dramatize. The facts spoke for themselves. Claire watched as Daniel tried to respond, but his words faltered. He could not undo the clarity of the proof laid out before everyone. Vanessa, too, realized the game was over. The people who had expected to witness a triumphant announcement now watched the opposite, two calm, dignified individuals exposing years of deceit without losing their composure. Michael's quiet confidence complemented Claire's steady presence. Together, they had turned the room upside down, not through anger, not through shouting, but through truth and preparation. Every lie that Daniel and Vanessa had built their arrogance on was now visible to all. Control had shifted, and it was clear who held the power. By the end of the evening, the celebration Daniel and Vanessa had planned was gone. What replaced it was the respect and attention Claire and Michael commanded. They hadn't sought humiliation or revenge, they had sought justice, clarity, and dignity. The balance had changed, and everyone in the room could see it. Claire felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had handled everything on her own terms. The betrayal had been exposed, and the truth was undeniable. The turning point had arrived, and for the first time in months, she felt completely in control of her life and her future. After the gathering, the consequences hit Daniel and Vanessa faster than they expected. Daniel had always relied on charm and appearances to maintain his reputation, but now every lie, every secret, and every betrayal was visible to those who mattered most: family, friends, and colleagues. People who had once trusted him started questioning his honesty, his decisions, and even his character. Invitations, business opportunities, and social connections quietly disappeared. The life he had built on deception began to unravel piece by piece, leaving him exposed, embarrassed, and powerless. Vanessa faced her own reality. She had believed that being involved in the affair gave her excitement and influence, but now the admiration she thought she commanded vanished. She was no longer seen as glamorous or untouchable. Instead, she was recognized for what she truly was: a participant in calculated betrayal, someone who had helped destroy trust and happiness. The social circles she had moved in began distancing themselves, and the facade of success she had relied on crumbled quickly. The admiration and attention she once enjoyed turned into judgment and disappointment. The humiliation Daniel and Vanessa had aimed at Claire and Michael returned in full force. Every mocking look, every cruel word, and every moment of superiority they had projected now bounced back to them. Instead of being untouchable, they were exposed, vulnerable, and ashamed. The control they had tried to assert over others was stripped away, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions without any support or defense. Meanwhile, Claire and Michael watched quietly as the situation unfolded. They did not celebrate or gloat. There was no need. The truth and the evidence they had gathered were enough to ensure justice was served. Daniel and Vanessa had played a dangerous game, and now they were living with the results. It was a reminder that deceit and arrogance only work until someone patient and careful decides to act. As weeks passed, Daniel struggled to regain stability. The financial plans he thought were secure were now questioned, and legal advisors scrutinized every step he had taken. Vanessa, too, realized that her reputation was permanently affected. Friends and acquaintances no longer trusted her judgment, and the excitement of her secret life had vanished entirely. They had underestimated Claire and Michael at every turn, assuming silence and patience were weakness. That mistake cost them everything they had hoped to gain. For Claire and Michael, witnessing the consequences brought closure. They hadn't sought revenge, they had sought fairness, dignity, and the restoration of their own lives. Daniel and Vanessa faced the impact of their choices fully, and the humiliation they had once imposed on others now belonged to them. It was a turning point that marked the end of deception and the beginning of freedom for those who had once been trapped in the web of lies. The tables had been turned completely, and justice, calm and precise, had been served. After everything that had happened, Claire and Michael felt a strange sense of calm. The chaos, betrayal, and humiliation were behind them, but the emotional wounds remained. They spent time together, not as friends, not as lovers, but as allies who had shared an experience that neither could forget. Their bond was built on honesty and understanding, not on hatred or revenge. They could talk openly about what had happened, and simply being understood brought a sense of relief neither had felt in months. Claire realized that carrying anger and resentment would only weigh her down. She didn't need to hate Daniel to move forward. The betrayal had been painful, but it didn't define her. It didn't take away her intelligence, her kindness, or her strength. Michael felt the same way. While the betrayal had hurt deeply, he understood that holding on to bitterness would not help him rebuild his life. They supported each other in focusing on what mattered, healing and reclaiming control over their own futures. They spent quiet afternoons reviewing plans, discussing their next steps, and sharing personal victories. Claire returned to routines she had neglected: exercise, reading, and hobbies that gave her joy. Michael focused on his work and personal projects, regaining confidence in his abilities. They encouraged each other to prioritize self-care and independence, reminding each other that they were capable of thriving despite what had been done to them. Over time, Claire noticed a change in herself. She no longer felt anxious about Daniel or haunted by his actions. Instead, she felt empowered, knowing that she had survived betrayal and come out stronger. She could think clearly, make decisions without fear, and plan her life according to her own values. Michael, too, grew more confident and self-assured. Together, they realized that the betrayal had been a painful lesson, but it had also given them clarity about what they truly deserved in life. They didn't need to reconcile with the past. They didn't need to seek revenge or punish anyone further. Instead, they focused on building their futures, learning that self-respect and dignity were more important than anger. The support they gave each other was quiet but powerful, like a steady hand guiding them through recovery. By the end of this period, Claire understood that healing wasn't about forgetting or ignoring what had happened. It was about accepting the truth, learning from it, and using it to become stronger. Betrayal didn't define her life, it had only revealed how capable she was of resilience and growth. Michael felt the same. They parted ways with mutual respect and gratitude for the connection they had formed, knowing that their paths were separate but stronger because of the experience they had shared. Both walked forward with renewed confidence, free from hatred, and ready to create lives built on honesty, dignity, and self-worth. Claire stood in her new apartment, the soft light of late afternoon spilling across the floor. The space was quiet, peaceful, and entirely hers. She took a deep breath and thought about everything that had happened: the humiliation, the lies, the betrayal. None of it had been easy, but she had survived. More than that, she had learned something important: true victory wasn't about punishing anyone else. It was about reclaiming herself. She looked around the apartment and smiled. Every item, every little corner, reflected choices she had made for herself. She had worked hard to regain control over her finances, her confidence, and her independence. She didn't need Daniel or Vanessa to acknowledge her strength, she felt it deep within. The quiet victories, the moments of preparation, the calm decisions, the patience, had built a foundation she could rely on. Claire thought about the past with clarity. She no longer carried anger as a constant companion. She understood that holding on to rage would only have chained her to the events she had already survived. Instead, she focused on peace, on moving forward, and on living a life that reflected her values. The betrayal had tested her, but it hadn't broken her. It had revealed a strength she hadn't fully recognized before. She remembered the people who had supported her, the lessons she had learned, and the careful planning that had allowed her to reclaim her dignity. Every step she had taken, every decision to remain patient and strategic, had been part of turning the tables without needing to create chaos. Quiet strength had been her greatest weapon. As she packed away old belongings, mementos of a life tied to lies and manipulation, she felt a sense of closure. She didn't need to look back at Daniel or Vanessa. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone else. The power had always been hers to reclaim, and she had done it fully. The past belonged to them, but the future belonged to her. Claire stepped to the door, her hand lingering on the handle. She closed it slowly, deliberately, with no anger or resentment, only peace. This act wasn't about revenge, it was about finality, about choosing herself over bitterness and hurt. She had survived humiliation, betrayal, and manipulation. She had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever before. In that moment, Claire understood the most important truth: life doesn't measure success by how loudly you strike back, but by how fully you can reclaim your own power. She didn't need to destroy anyone else to win. She had already won by rebuilding herself, step by step, with patience, clarity, and dignity. Walking away from the past, she carried strength, confidence, and the knowledge that no betrayal could ever take away the life she had now earned for herself.